Hi everyone, my name is Danny Rego. I'm here for Champion Briefs doing a video topic analysis for the January topic. We have two really big tournaments coming up this weekend, one at Emory and one at Lexington High School in Massachusetts. So I'm just here to try and break down the topic to make it easier for you to relay your strategies and ideas to the judge. And after judging multiple rounds on this topic, I think I might be able to provide you guys with some insights as to how you can go ahead and do that. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how rounds should be going on this topic versus how rounds are going on this topic. Because I think that it's becoming very problematic with the way that kids are choosing to take this topic. It's making it a lot harder for us to go ahead and be able to adjudicate it very easily. So right now, the way topics are going, the way debates are going on this topic, is that kids are making very blippy extensions of arguments. Essentially, they're just saying extend this card, extend this card, extend this piece of evidence. And that's becoming very problematic because for us as judges, we aren't able to analyze that evidence unless you tell us how we ought to be analyzing it. So it's really problematic when people are just trying to get up and win every single argument on the flow, and they're not actually debating the topic. They're merely just trying to extend their opponents, which becomes really problematic in terms of making the decision because it makes the round extremely muddled when you're not actually responding to the argumentation that your opponents are giving. You're simply either trying to extend evidence that they didn't respond to or extend around the responses that they read. So it becomes very hard for us as judges to be able to adjudicate these types of claims and to be able to adjudicate these types of arguments. So what that means is the way this topic should be going, it ought to be going in a way in which debaters are providing a lot of analysis. And this sounds relatively simple in terms of, oh, I definitely do this all the time. But most debaters don't. In fact, I gave this exact same preferences before I judged every single round at the tournament, at the rounds that I've judged, and no one was able to do so. No one actually ended up giving the analysis that was needed, except for maybe in one or two cases. So what do I mean by give analysis, and what does that mean? So the first thing is that you should be boiling down the round to 2 or 3 big issues. I would say 4 issues at the maximum, because at that point it becomes a lot harder in the later speeches to go ahead and choose which arguments to go for and choose which voting issue is the most important, because you just have so much on the flow that you're trying to go for all of it, so you're not able to explain all the other arguments to your fullest abilities. So when you boil down the round, there are a couple of questions that you need to look at. So the first would be why are these the main issues that you're choosing? You need to relay this idea to the judge. Because if you're just saying, oh, we're going to talk about terrorism, education, and military aid being horrible, that doesn't tell us why those are the voting issues, right? Like, you can't just be like, these are the voting issues, like, have fun. You need to go ahead and explain to us why they're the voting issues, so that way when we evaluate them when we're making our decisions in the later speeches, like after the final focuses, we're able to pinpoint why this is a specific reason why we should be voting for you. The second question that you need to be answering is why or how are these reasons, or why or how are you winning these arguments? And that's like obviously the biggest of the 3, because if you're winning the arguments, then we're able to evaluate those in your favor and then vote for you. So you need to explain to us, not just by extending pieces of evidence underneath these arguments, you need to be explaining what the evidence means underneath those voting issues, and that'll enable us to fully understand the argument that you're trying to convey to us as judges in order to pass that on and put it on our ballots. That's going to be really important, because if you're not telling us how you're winning the argument, but you're just extending evidence underneath the argument, you're not actually winning the argument, because you're not telling us why or how that's the case. You're simply just saying, look, we're present underneath the argument, but that isn't a reason to vote for you. But the third question that you should be looking to is, why are these issues more important than the issues that your opponents are bringing up? That's going to be really important, because that is going to be the basis of the weighing mechanisms, the weighing mechanisms are going to be the basis of answering this question. That's also extremely important, because when we tell kids to weigh, as when we're judging, kids think that they're doing it by saying, oh, we save more lives, therefore our argument is more important than their argument. But that's not actually weighing. That's not meaningful analysis about why your arguments are more important than your opponent's arguments. So what that means is we need you to go ahead and not only tell us why these are the voting issues, how you're winning those voting issues, but you need to tell us why these voting issues are the most important in the round, and that doesn't only center around the idea that you save more lives, because that's not meaningful analysis. By meaningful analysis, we need you to fully explain to us the warrants and impacts of your arguments and what that means for the overall Sahel region or Sahel region of Africa, and that way we're better able to adjudicate those voting issues at the end of the round. That's going to be really important going into tournaments like Emory and Big Lex, where you have a very strong mix of lay judges, judges from different regions that you're not used to debating in, and former debaters who are technical judges. I think that's going to be a very strong suit. If you're able to answer those 3 questions efficiently, there's no reason why you shouldn't be winning rounds. In fact, most judges will tell you that if you answer more of these questions than your opponents do, then they're probably going to vote for you, because at that point, there's a clearer ballot story to vote for you, and that's going to be really important. I think students in public forum debate have started deviating from this idea of ballot stories as to why you ought to be winning the round, as opposed to just trying to win the arguments and out-debate their opponents. That's becoming really problematic because the avenues for the ballot are becoming harder and harder to find because there's zero analysis as to what should the avenue be. So like instead of saying winning 1 or 2 major arguments within the round, each team is solely trying to fight for every single argument, that the extensions at the end of the final focus lead us to choose what we think is the most important issue in order to vote for that. So that's problematic. So answering these questions are going to be key going forward, not only for this topic, but for other topics. But why is it important for this topic specifically? So the word prioritize makes this topic very muddled. I have yet to see a very clear debate in terms of what the issues being discussed are on both sides, because it leads to a situation in which there's a huge debate that lasts for about 20 minutes as to what the word prioritize actually means, and that steers away from being able to debate the topic. But also the term prioritize makes it very hard to have an impact calculus in terms of determining what is the most important issue, or what would be the issue that we ought to deal with first. Insofar as that's true, these debate rounds become muddled. So in order to clear those types of issues up, drawing the comparative analysis and comparative world is going to be the easiest way to make it clear to the judge why you're winning the round. So what do I mean by comparative analysis? When I tell this to students before rounds begin, they somehow, for some reason, think I'm talking about, in the final focus, giving 1 minute of what an affirmative world looks like and then another minute of what the negative world looks like. That's not the comparative analysis that I'm talking about. When I'm talking about comparative analysis, that means evaluating on each issue what an affirmative world and what a negative world looks like, and intertwining that analysis to then explain to us as judges what that means in terms of your side in your ballot story. And ballot stories are extremely important because they're a cohesive it's like a cohesive reasoning as to why we're voting for you. It's not like we're voting for you solely off of this one specific impact coming off of your terrorism argument, but then also this one turn on their agriculture argument. As opposed to the ballot story is a full-length reasoning as to when you extend the terrorism argument and you give us the analysis that because there's rampant terrorism in this region, we're not actually able to go ahead and engage in agricultural product or agricultural assistance. That is a more cohesive reasoning. When you tie these arguments together, it makes it easier for us as judges to be able to, decide which side has actually won this argument when you're providing us the analysis as to why you won it, as opposed to just trying to extend every argument underneath it, because that's not winning the argument when you're not telling us what that analysis means. But I think I've talked enough about sort of the meta strategy that you should be approaching this topic with in terms of how you should be looking at rounds. So I kind of want to talk about what your general strategy should be as the affirmative and as the negative, and there are a couple different options. But the first thing I want to talk about is that I think it's ultimately easier for the negative side to win on this topic because they can simply outwork your opponents. Like, literally all you have to do is just prove that development assistance is bad in order to win the round. But we're going to talk about that in a minute or two. And the first thing I want to talk about in terms of what frameworks you should be attempting to run on the affirmative and on the negative. So on the affirmative, I think it's very clear to establish what the term prioritize means early in the round, because it's going to be very important progressing into the round, because the negative strategy is usually talking about how we should be dealing with things in order of importance, and that's going to be what prioritize means. But I think a more realistic definition of prioritize is simply, what's the end goal? If the end goal is to lead to the development of the Sahel region of Africa, that's probably going to be what we ought to be prioritizing, right? And I think that's going to be extremely important. So I think that you need to do a very clear job of determining what prioritize is at the top of any affirmative case, because otherwise you just allow the negative to come up with their definition, and then the definitional debate ensues for the next 10 minutes. Well, granted, it's probably going to ensue anyways, but as long as you have that framework at the beginning of the round with a carded definition, it's going to be easier for you to come out on top. And anyways, I think that this is the more logical, intuitive definition of prioritize, because it's simply like at the point where aid occurs concurrently, both military and development in the Sahel region, it's really hard to say we should do this first and then do that when both things are already happening at the same time. So I think that ultimately makes it easier for you to logically explain why it should be either what the end goal of aid is or what the most important issue is within the Sahel region and how we ought to be addressing that. So that way it's also not an abusive definition, that like NEG still has all of their ground in terms of terrorism, in terms of prerequisite, which we'll talk about later, but you're not limiting their ground, you're simply outlining a very clear, fair burden that establishes to both sides of the debate. But secondly, what I would tell you is that in terms of the negative and the frameworks that you should be running, there are a couple of things. So you can either make this analysis at the top of either the negative case, the negative rebuttal, or the negative summary. It really doesn't matter, because it's a very quick framework analysis that's very true and the affirmative can't really respond to. So it's the analysis that there are a couple of avenues that you can use to win the round. As the negative, you don't have to prove that military aid is good to win the round. You can certainly do that to prove that military aid should be prioritized over development assistance, but that isn't the only avenue for you. The main avenue, I think, like the easiest avenue, is simply to prove that development aid shouldn't be prioritized. That's really important, because that means that you can win off of terminal defense within the round. But what does terminal defense mean? That means that your rebuttal speech that simply delinks affirmative argumentation can actually be round-winning arguments for you, because the wording of the resolution being that development assistance should be prioritized over military aid leads to a situation in which the negative only has the sole burden to prove that development aid should not be prioritized at all. Insofar as that's true, they don't have to prove that military assistance is good or that military assistance is effective. All they have to prove is that development assistance is very harmful, or that development assistance simply just shouldn't be prioritized. So they can do that by proving that military aid is better, that both of them are harmful, or that development aid is harmful. It's very easy for the negative to win, and that's what I was talking about when I was saying that I think the negative can win very easily by simply outworking your opponents. That's going to be really important when you're addressing like arguments later on the round, and as the round boils down, it means that on the negative you have an easier time to boil down the round, because all you technically have to boil the round down to is the reasons why your opponents can't win. On this topic, it becomes an issue a lot of the times where the negative wins solely because the affirmative doesn't. And as bad as that sounds, that's the wording of the topic, and we're kind of forced to deal with it. If the affirmative wants to make a reasonable argument in terms of a meta debate argument about why the negative should have to debate the converse of the affirmative, I think you can make a very strong, compelling analysis as to why that is, why that would be the case in terms of, say, fairness of ground or fairness in the round, because it leads to a situation in which the negative has so much less of a burden in the round in order to win that the debate becomes extremely unfair, and it is very hard for the affirmative to win rounds. So the affirmative could definitely get away with that framework argument. Like, I would be very inclined to buy those types of that type of argumentation. So yeah. So after that, let's talk about some arguments that you can address within the round. So on the affirmative, what I think is really important, and I think people started steering away from this type of argumentation in the rounds that I saw. I think people were focusing too much on very nitty-gritty types of development aid, say just the spread of vaccines or giving them food aid, or things that are ultra-specific but yet still general ideas. But what do I think is the best argumentation or line of argumentation for the affirmative teams? So I would say that it's a combination of like institution building within these nations, because there's no way that any other aid, even including military aid, can be successful if there aren't proper institutions in place for that aid to be effective and for it to be effectively utilized. So I think that the affirmative should spend a lot of time developing why institutions are necessary within these nations in order for them to become like developed nations into the future. Like, in order for development to be possible within these nations, why institutions are necessary. And by that I mean political and economic institutions within the nation. But also underneath that argument, I think it's really important that we also talk about the type of infrastructure that's currently present within these nations, because a lot of these nations, in terms of like getting to the rural areas, don't have very much infrastructure, which becomes very problematic in terms of future development of this country when they aren't able to effectively transfer goods from one place to another, or the government isn't able to actually govern over all of its citizens within its borders because it doesn't have a means of doing so, because there's no way for it to get out to the rural areas. So I think the affirmative has the strongest chance of winning the round by talking about current development aid in the Sahel region that specifically targets infrastructure and institution building within these countries. That's going to be the most important thing, because I think that's the true prerequisite to any sort of argument within the round. Because recognize that the negative is going to get up and talk a lot about military training and instilling issues of, or instilling professionalism and I guess the respect for authority of civilian government. But the problem is if there's no strong civilian government to respect in the first place, the military is never going to have these professionalism, or these intonations of professionalism actually meaningfully implemented within the military. So I think that this is the true prerequisite that the affirmative can utilize in order to win the round. But on top of this, another argument that they can go for in terms of development assistance are going to be development assistance that establishes resilience within the region. That's going to be really important, because when you're looking at the grand scheme of things, in order to develop resilience within that region in terms of long-term sustainability of avenues of things like agriculture and things like food, it's going to be the most important to be able to allow them to come back from aid shocks or come back from droughts on their own, as opposed to simply addressing these types of issues by giving them tons of food, right? If we can go ahead and teach them how they should be doing these things, that's going to be the most helpful in terms of allowing them to become self-sustaining into the future. Now, in terms of the negative, I think that there are also a couple of arguments that you can be looking to. In terms of the negative, I think the strongest arguments in terms of how you should be ordering your case strategically would first be an argument about why military assistance is beneficial at the top of the case. And this is going to be mainly a time suck when you're addressing, or later on in the round, because like I was talking about before, you don't need to win that military aid is good in order to win the round. But I guarantee you that every affirmative team is going to spend about 2 to 3 minutes of their rebuttal speech attacking why military aid has either never worked or specifically won't work in the Sahel region of Africa. Insofar as that's true, I think that you would then have a lot of ground to cover, or they would have a lot of ground to cover with your second contention that I simply think would be like 4 or 5 different reasons as to why development assistance either doesn't work or is inefficient until we solve current problems in the Sahel region. And that's why it shouldn't be prioritized, because it's simply going to be a waste of resources when it's just being money is being thrown at problems without any meaningful solutions to those problems. So I think that's going to be the best structure of a negative case, is simply just development aid solves, or development aid is good in creating sustainability or in creating actual effective governance. And then the second argument that you should be going for is that development aid in the status quo is going to be really harmful to the region, or simply doesn't help the region develop as it should. It doesn't actually accomplish the goals necessary, and because it isn't efficient at accomplishing its goals, it definitely shouldn't be prioritized. And there are a couple of different links that you can look to that. And the first one would namely be terrorism within the region, in terms of terrorism, like terrorists attacking aid sites, or terrorists going ahead and creating fear of non-governmental organizations, that they don't want to go ahead and come into these regions because they're afraid that terrorists are either going to attack these facilities, or that they're going to kidnap aid employees or do anything to disrupt aid flows in that region. The second link that you can look to would be this idea of corruption within the government, and that's also another important aspect to look like, is how do we truly solve for corruption? And I think there's an argument to be made that military aid can actually root out corruption. Now, there's been a lot of debate that I've recognized about military coups within Africa, or within the Sahel region, in terms of when we have things like the Pan-Sahel Initiative. So what I think is really important, and what you can go for, is this idea that military coups don't necessarily have to be bad. Recognize if the government that was in power before the coup took place was a dictatorial, oppressive regime, it doesn't matter that they stay in power. If anything, there's probably more of a benefit that they aren't in power anymore, because they can't continue to abuse aid that we give them, and they can continue to abuse their people. I think that's going to be a very compelling argument as to why military aid is beneficial. You can make arguments as to why military coups in certain instances are actually beneficial for the country. Recognize that multiple military coups probably wouldn't be beneficial, but I think there's definitely an argument to be made to prove that in order to root out corruption, military coups are a necessary evil. And there are a couple other links that you can look to, but for those, you should definitely go ahead and look at the January brief that we have on sale on our website. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this helps you guys going into these tournaments this weekend, and good luck.